The national debt has surged past $36 trillion, threatening our security. Yet both politicians and the public seem to remain indifferent. Mark Murphy from the Committee for Responsible Budget Policy explains the crisis and what his group says Americans and Oklahomans need to be doing right now. I want to welcome the Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, Mike Murphy. Mike, good to have you.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be on with you.
Good to be on with you. Good to see pictures of your kids, especially the one with the Packers jersey on. Go Pack, go. And I wanted to start with the title of your organization, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. I mean, that sort of sounds like a comedy. That does not seem to be something that's taken seriously. But, when we were just talking briefly before we started recording, we were talking about the organization, but it's my understanding that it has a tie all the way back to former Senator and former Governor Henry Bellman.
That's true. Yes, the organization's a nonpartisan nonprofit group that was founded in the 80s, and it's been around for a while, and it's grown significantly in the last 20 years or so. We have a staff of about 30 based outside of Washington, D.C., and yeah, we advocate for fiscal responsibility. And you're correct, Scott. The name sometimes people think is kind of like a punchline, but we're sort of like a lonely voice here in the wilderness of folks trying to advocate for getting our country on a more sustainable fiscal path. But yes, we've been around for a long time, and the debt and deficits actually are at historically high levels now, and it makes our job, I think, more important these days.
Tell us a little bit about your organization. You mentioned when it got started, but what specifically you're trying to do, and you're reaching out to citizens and people all over the country because of why?
So we advocate for fiscal responsibility. And a lot of people, when they think about fiscal responsibility, I think it just means a balanced budget. And that's not necessarily actually what we advocate for per se, although we wouldn't mind if we eventually reached one. We believe that the fiscal course of the country, Scott, is unsustainable. And what I mean by that is that our debt right now is at approaching historically high levels. A lot of people think of debt at as talking about the 36 trillion number, which is very hard to grasp, $36 trillion of debt. What we look at is our debt measured as a percentage of our economy, because it basically gives you a sense of what the level is to service that debt, right? And our debt right now as a percentage of our economy is almost at 100%. It's almost the entire size of our economy. It's growing faster than our economy, right? So our debt as a percentage of GDP is going to surpass the levels that we saw right after World War II, which was the highest levels we ever had. And it's going to skyrocket as far as the eye can see. And we think that this debt threatens our economy, threatens our national security. It obviously puts a burden on future generations. And so what we're doing is we work actively inside the Beltway in Washington to try to work with members of Congress, certainly with the new administration, to try to advocate for getting this under control. But we're trying to get out in states, including in Oklahoma, because we hear from members, they tell us we need to hear more about this back home. We hear about a lot of issues when we go back home. We need to hear more about the debt and deficit so that we can get the push to start to focus on this more here in Washington. So that's what we're doing, Scott. We're trying to talk to people all over the country, including in Oklahoma, to try to advocate for getting this debt and deficit under control.
Every week, I talk with their DC chief, Alex Cameron, about the things that are happening with our delegation. Try to make, Alex does a great job of letting people in Oklahoma, Tulsa and Oklahoma City understand how what's happening in DC impacts them back here. And we spent a lot of time in December talking about the reconciliation, the debt limit issues. It's so difficult to understand. It's so arcane, so in the weeds, but help us understand the terms deficit, debt, and then what's on the line in terms of this next Congress and the new administration, which is going to be sworn in a few days.
Sure. So you're right, Scott. A lot of these terms are thrown around. A lot of them are kind of go over people's heads, or some of them is pretty technical, all sorts of things. They kind of get used interchangeably, right? So deficit What a deficit is simply the difference between spending and revenues, right? And the result, right? So it's the gap between how much the government is spending versus how much the government takes in. And we are now, right now, approaching a nearly $2 trillion annual deficit. So deficits on a given year. The debt can be thought of as the accumulation of all those deficits over time, right? And so the debt, and that accumulates with interest, right? And so the debt is, like I said, it's about 36 trillion is gross national debt. It's a little less than that when you kind of take into account that we have some, which we can get into if you'd like, some borrowing that we do from ourselves. Okay, we borrow from Social Security and things like that, intergovernmental transfers, which is a whole other technical term. But the debt is the accumulation of past deficits. We can think of that. As that relates to your question, Scott, of what's going on in Washington now and how it relates to these issues, you bring up two words you said that have been kind of tossed around recently: reconciliation, debt limit. Those are big ones that are going on. I'll try to explain that briefly. So what's going on in Washington right now is with the new incoming Congress and the new administration, there's obviously a lot of impetus to get one's agenda done. And there's a process built into the congressional budget laws. It's called budget reconciliation, and what essentially it is it's a mechanism to put forward policies. They have to have policies that have some kind of budgetary impact. But the reason that budget reconciliation has become something that's been more known these days is what it can do is it's a mechanism that allows you to pass things in the Senate with only a majority vote. So you don't have to get the usual 60 votes in the Senate, which overcomes the filibuster if you use budget reconciliation. Okay, and so what's going on right now in Washington is there's discussion amongst Republicans in Congress of how they're going to try to pack the different things in their agenda, whether that be immigration, energy policy, and how to deal with the expiration of tax cuts that are happening at the end of the year, and a debate on how we're going to package this all into a budget reconciliation bill that can be passed and bypass the Senate filibuster. Okay, that's what reconciliation is. So we can get into the details on that. What the debt limit is the debt limit is a mechanism that's been in place for over 100 years. And what essentially it is that a debt limit is set at a certain amount of debt, and you have to lift the debt limit if Congress wants to issue more debt. So as I said, we're running deficits right now, and those debt and deficits keep going up. So for Congress to have the authority to borrow more money, it has to lift that debt limit to allow them to do so. The history behind this is a little complicated, Scott, but in short, up until about the early 1900s, every time every time that the president wanted to issue bonds to borrow money for something, they had to go to Congress basically on every single time and say, do you approve this? Do you approve this? Do you approve this? What the debt limit allows it to do is like lift it to a certain amount. So you don't have to go back to them every time, right? Because laws are passed, you have to borrow for those. I shouldn't have to go back to you every time to then sort of like pay for those laws that you passed. What it allows is to borrow to pay for past priorities. So the debt limit's been reinstated. They're going to have to pass another debt limit increase sometime this year. They believe by around the summer. And so there's a debate going on right now on how they'll go about doing that, whether they'll attach certain things to it. So those are two big moments, Scott, that are going on. Reconciliation to try to figure out how they're going to pack a lot of pieces into their agenda and pass it. The debt limit, because you have to increase that limit sometime this year. Otherwise, you default on your debt obligations, which would be negative ramifications for the country.